Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka, Director of the Iran Program and Senior Fellow of the Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Russia and China, Common Interests and Rivalry in the Black Sea, Caspian, and Central Asia regions. Russia's recent Kavkaz 2020 military exercises have demonstrated the scale and scalability of Russian military capabilities. The exercise, comprising roughly of 80,000 soldiers, took place in Russia's southern military district, a region stretching from Crimea, the Caspian Sea, and the North Caucasus. China, Iran, and a number of other states also took part in Kavkaz 2020. Today, we have an outstanding group of experts to discuss the interplay of international cooperation in the Black Sea region and Central Asia, and assess the Russian and Chinese relationship in and around the Caspian Sea. First, I would like to welcome Mark Galeotti, a non-resident scholar with Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative. Mark also runs his own consultancy, Mayak Intelligence. Next, we have Bruce Pannier. Bruce is a senior Central Asia correspondent at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and an editor of Kishlak Ovazi. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Niva Yao. Niva is a resident researcher at OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and a fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. MEI's Frontier Europe program explores interactions between the Middle East countries and their European neighbors, the parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, which form a frontier between Western Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. For more information on this program, please visit our website or follow the Frontier program Twitter handle at MEI Frontier. For today's events, to submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email also events@mei.edu. And most importantly, do feel free to ask questions at any time throughout this 1 hour long panel, or roughly about an hour. That, I guess, depends largely on how many good questions we get in from the audience as well. I'll be looking for all of your questions and will factor in as many as possibly I can do for the benefit of the discussion. I want to start off with Mark. Mark, we only have an hour. I have so many questions, but I wanted to ask you if you could start off by giving us a sense of what you made of Kavkaz 2020 military exercises that were just held a few weeks ago in September. And if you could put that in perhaps in some historic context, and most maybe relevant to the time of this panel, to what's going on in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Please, Mark.
In 2 to 3 minutes, no problem. Yes, Kavkaz, I mean, it's a standard series of exercises that the Russians run. So it's just fortuitous that it happened to take place at the same time as this upsurge in tensions in the South Caucasus. And it was interesting because, as you said, 80,000 troops and some non-military personnel. And it really demonstrated the range of Russian options in the region, and particularly ones that in hindsight look actually very relevant to the current conflict. We saw them testing out ways of combating drones, and we've seen Azeri-fielded Turkish drones and Israeli loitering munitions playing a particular role in the fighting. We saw quite an emphasis on power projection, on the capacity to actually sort of transfer forces into both contested and non-contested environments, which again would seem to have a sort of clear relevance here. We also saw the participation of Armenian forces and the integration of the two bases that Russia has in Armenia, a land base and an air base. So all of these actually emphasize the point that actually Russia has a lot of options. And therefore, the fact that it is playing such a low-key role at the moment in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh is not because it can't, it's because it won't. It's about choice. It's about actually not being willing to get involved or not knowing how to be involved. But we can talk about that afterwards. The final point I would make is precisely about the international dimension of this. I mean, I mentioned Armenia. You mentioned the fact that also there were Chinese forces present. Again, not a particularly large contingent, but a real contingent. This wasn't just kind of glorified observers. We saw both light and heavy armor being deployed. We saw the first use of the new Chinese transport plane to bring them into the theater. So this is actually a real thing. And finally, it's worth noting also that Iran was involved. And again, Russia very much uses these exercises to do two things. One is actually to test out how it interoperates with other countries. And the second one is to signal that kind of interoperation to interested Western parties. People want to know actually the nuts and bolts of the exercise. CNA's Mike Kaufman's blog, Russian Military Analysis, has a day-by-day breakdown that covers all the detail, but that's the kind of big picture take I would give.
Mark, let me ask you again to sort of dig a bit deeper in terms of the point you made about power projection. Before you get to that, just for the sake of the audience and educating all of us, where did you last see something like this take place in terms of Russian organizing military exercises on this scale? I mean, 80,000 sounds pretty big. I might be off here. Maybe this is the normal. But tell me if it is something unusually large. The timing shouldn't surprise us. I understand these are annual military exercises. But where else in Russian Federation in recent years have you seen anything like this? And this power projection, who is it all aimed at, and who is it signaling to?
Well, in terms of the scale, I mean, actually, the Russians like big exercises, it has to be said. And in fact, we saw, for example, in the East, the Vostok East exercises, which again had a definite sort of Chinese component. We could talk about that later. So, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say the size is that huge, especially when you factor in that 80,000 also includes National Guard, emergencies ministries, and other not technically military elements. Again, it's a part of the way that the Russians have a much more integrated approach to warfare. The power projection point, though, that is an interesting one worth dwelling on. Obviously, they think a lot about what scenarios each of their various military exercises are going to be wargaming, both because they want to train for the kind of operations that they think they will have to fight, but again, also because of signaling. When we saw recent exercises, for example, up in Belarus, where very much the scenario in which it was based was this notion that foreign-backed insurgents and protesters had taken locations with the support of foreign special forces that had to be driven out. So that was a kind of a clear warning that they saw insurgency in Belarus as actually a product of foreign sort of mischief-making rather than just simply domestic political unrest. So there is always a political message to the scenarios. In this case, yes, we saw the notion of terrorist attacks. It always seems to be terrorists with tanks and long-range military capability. But nonetheless, so terrorist attacks is kind of the excuse that they used. But precisely, they very much emphasize this point about using particularly the air assault troops, their very large paratrooper force, both in terms of paradrops, but also helicopter deployments. And in the context of the South Caucasus, what they're doing is they're showing, first of all, that they have a range of military capabilities, including, for example, the 34th Brigade, which is a specialized mountain warfare unit, which again is particularly relevant in Nagorno mountainous Karabakh. But more generally, it's really an exercise that could almost be calculated to emphasize this role of Russia as the regional hegemon. Russia as the power that can reach out across the region, even where it doesn't immediately have a land border in play, whether it's by air or by sea, and impose its will. And of that, there is no question. And again, so this is why I come back to this point about the interesting mismatch between capabilities and apparent will and intent.
Right. Thank you, Mark. I mean, I want to come back to you in the next round. Some of the countries that are, again, reportedly involved or were involved, just to give you their names. And again, I hope these reports are accurate. You mentioned Iran, there was Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Sri Lanka, Armenia, China, which we'll get to now with NEVA coming up, Myanmar, and Pakistan. I understand the Indians pulled out last minute, citing COVID as a reason. Others would
though more likely because of Pakistan.
Exactly. But you know, when I see Sri Lanka, Myanmar, I'm wondering if this is sort of the coalition to show off, or this is coalition to actually do something specifically, say around the Caspian or Black Sea. But I get to that in the next round. Thank you, Mark. Neva, how did it all look like to you? And what would you say? I mean, China was a participant in this. I think Mark said there were not that many foreign participants in these exercises. I don't know the size of the Chinese. Maybe you can tell us if you know. But what was China, trying to achieve by participating? And how would you assess overall the Russian-Chinese military-to-military cooperation? And again, it doesn't have to be limited to Kavkaz 2020. You can bring it to closer to Central Asia where you're located. And I should have said at the outset, our speakers today are coming in from London. In the case of Mark, Neva is calling from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and Bruce is calling in from the headquarters of Radio Free Europe in Prague in Czech Republic. But Neva, please go ahead and react to Mark in whichever way you like.
Yeah, I mean, Mark already pointed out this really important, bit with China coming in this time in the war games that, a lot of people were wondering, what exactly can the Y-20 do? And this time China for the first time showed it. I mean, not even domestically, China never showed it, but this time China showed this really detailed video of how the Y-20 can load and unload very heavy vehicles. So that, I think, is a really important point. It is quite minor, but for China to really showcase their capabilities is something that, is quite significant when it comes to working with Russia in this kind of, military little showcase. So I think, obviously in military, Beijing really lacks the kind of combat experience that Russia has, and that it really treasures the kind of, I suppose we can call it learning experience from Russian personnel at an individual officer to officer level. It's interesting because I think Mark, also pointed it out. Each of these countries that participated had the kind of scenario in mind, what kind of forces to mobilize and what kind of international support that they would have in their own little scenario. So for China, the team that they took to Russia was the group from the Western Theater, which is the one responsible for Xinjiang and Tibet. And while this is quite significant, the actual staff, the actual head of the team that they took to Russia was actually the deputy, so he's not the head. Mainly because, I mean, China on the 1st of October for China's National Day, it has they also had the second military parade in 4 years. So President Xi Jinping really liked to show, his military powers and the kind of things that he has invested in the military kind of business. So he's the one that is actually really keen to join international kind of military exercises like these. So it's not kind of so it's not really a surprise that China is joining Russia so much more now in recent years, because even domestically it was only under Xi Jinping that we have seen 2 military parades now in China, and no Chinese leader has done this after Mao 50 years ago. So I think in terms of what this means for China is to show that it has Russia's support in their terrorist scenario, regarding Afghanistan and the pipeline in Kazakhstan.
So just as a follow-up, the West, United States, were not mentioned. I'm assuming, and you didn't mention it. It's to prepare for the likes of international terrorism in places like Afghanistan or elsewhere. If you could just make sure I understood that right. Neva, I'm going to ask this question after you from Bruce, but why don't you give it a shot first? These might be the largest, exercises where China and Russia are together, but Russian-Chinese military cooperation go back to the 1990s. I mean, Bruce can maybe speak to this as well. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization was the first ones that wasn't military ties per se. It was more security, border security, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But you're saying this is the increase, that the momentum is picking up, and you put it down to the political will agenda of the Chinese leadership, in the case President Xi. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes. So it is changing. I think, first of all, in this particular Kavkaz 2020, China didn't mention any sort of particular scenarios. But what I was referring Afghanistan and the pipeline in Kazakhstan is the kind of general military exercises that China and Russia has done regionally in Central Asia. China has always kind of laid out these scenarios as terrorists coming in from these kind of corridors. So what I mean by, China and Russia closer these days. So whereas, the 1990s military exercise and the ones that were in early 2000s all the way up till mid 2000s, I mean, they were still heavily Russian language based. So when we look at the military exercises run by SCO, for example, they were entirely Russian. The Chinese personnel had to speak Russian because, I mean, the Kyrgyz did, the Tajik did, so that was the common language. But ever since India, Pakistan joined the SCO, everything within the SCO is internationalizing, and English became one of the official language. And this has really weakened kind of Russia's grip on the SCO and on the region, because now that there are other players now, and China obviously is, want to kind of move away from this very Russian dominated kind of like invisible hand in a lot of different areas. And even in military exercises, I think we're going to see a trend of different groups coming together. And of course, India refuses to work with Pakistan, but we're going to start seeing this diversity in language and diversity in different things that is no longer going to be a Russian-led military exercise.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Neva. Bruce, let me turn to you. I wanted to sort of react to what you heard Mark and Neva say first. And then if you could, I thought it would be very useful, and I'll give you this, if you don't mind, this job of putting it all in perspective. If you look back, going back from 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union to today, you've followed the trend, you've seen these types of military-to-military exercises involving sometimes on a bilateral basis, sometimes more than one or two countries, but groups of countries like we saw in Kavkaz 2020. What do you make of these latest events? I mean, are you alarmed by it? Do you see something qualitatively different now with these events of with the exercises in September? Or is this something you've seen before?
Personally, I mean, I don't see such a huge difference. It's always been in both these governments' interest to hold these joint exercises. It looks big on paper. You hear about China and Russia military cooperating together, and people start to go, oh my God, what is this all about? But when you look at the figures, and Mark even alluded to the fact that the Chinese contingent in the exercises in the South Caucasus or in the Kavkaz were not, they weren't really significant. And this is typical of what I've seen for Russian Chinese military exercises, and in the bigger framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The host country puts up most of the troops, obviously, and then the other countries seem to have a token presence in this, which can be several hundred troops, maybe even 1,000 or so. But rarely have they had like huge numbers of troops from one country go to the other for a military exercise. So it's, like I said, when you hear about it, it sounds fantastic. You're like, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they make a point of saying, how many people populate these countries, and you realize this is half the world, right? So the militaries, if you could conceive of the Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, and Russian militaries all cooperating together toward one single goal, that's pretty awesome to think about. But in fact, this is, like I said, so far anyway, this is just going to show. It serves Moscow's purpose. It serves Beijing's purpose that they have these kind of shows and make a big deal out of the friendship between the two countries. We know that history would suggest that on both sides, there's got to be some people who are wondering, how far do you go with this cooperation exactly? Because things could turn quickly, and they could be back. They've kind of gone this way throughout their history anyway. They're friends, they're enemies, they're friends, they're enemies. Of course, I think I'll talk a little bit about the military cooperation because, as you pointed out, this kind of started in 1996 when the then Shanghai Five met, and it's interesting. There's a military pact because at the time the whole purpose of the meeting in Shanghai was for border competence building measures. They were going to pull troops back from what had been the Soviet-Chinese border, decrease the amount of weapons that they had. It all sounded very good. That went so well that they expanded the focus of the group. Later on, they added economics. They wanted to build trade. They wanted to build economic ties between the two countries. And then in 1999, in the end of August, they met in Bishkek. And China had, of course, always been warning about the three evils: extremism, terrorism, separatism. But it wasn't falling on very attentive ears at the first couple meetings of the Shanghai Five. But in 1999, in late August, Russia had already started their second war in Chechnya, and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who are, of course, part of the, I should have said, Russia, China, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan had Islamic militants roaming in the mountains. So now the groundwork is laid for great cooperation on security matters. And from that, then you start to get, the idea that we'll hold joint military exercises. Diva already mentioned that. Some of them have involved, tens of thousands of troops. I appreciated that it was also mentioned that lately they haven't had those kind of that size exercises in Central Asia. They still do have exercises. A lot of times they're in Russia or China, well away from the Central Asian borders. But I think part of that, one of the results of the big exercises of 2006, 7, 8, that they held for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was that, and actually a little bit even earlier than that, you can see that Russia kind of was wondering about the Chinese military presence or cooperation at least with Central Asia. 2002 were the first exercises that China held, joint military exercises China held with Kyrgyzstan, for instance. And so that was something Russia obviously paid attention to. The next year, they opened their military base at Kant, mostly probably because the Americans were already using the base at Bishkek for their operation in Afghanistan, and Russia had concerns about militants from Afghanistan too. But one suspects that the opening of the base at Kant also was a response to the fact that China was starting to get much closer militarily in terms of cooperation to the Central Asians than it ever had been. Of course, it had zero influence in 1991. But 10 years later, they're already, a little bit more than 10 years later, they're already conducting joint military exercises, starting to negotiate arms deals where China can send them weapons, materials, things like that. And, so it's interesting that about that time, Russia paid much more attention to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which of course involves Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and twice Uzbekistan, although they're out at the moment. And they started emphasizing their own exercises within the framework of the CSTO, as it seemed like a counter to the exercises that were going on bilaterally between China and by this time, all the three Central Asian states. And then in 2016, of course, China comes to this new agreement with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, where they're also going to have a separate group that's going to concentrate on terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. Now, China and Russia, of course, have a common interest in Central Asia. It's the one thing that ties the Central Asians to them, and that is the militancy, which has been present in Afghanistan, and militants from all those countries are present in Afghanistan. So it's something they have to worry about. Central Asia borders both Russia and China, of course, although one would point out that Kazakhstan is a pretty big buffer zone, and of course narcotics trafficking. And both Russia and China have held cross-border operations, counter narcotics operations with Tajikistan and gone into Afghanistan after them. China now has a very small base by the Chinese border, but in the eastern Tajik mountains. And of course, they at least have helped the Afghan forces in the Wakhan corridor, which is just south of Tajikistan. And there's sufficient evidence to say that the People's Police of China are also operating in the Wakhan corridor just south of the Tajik border too. So there is a lot of cooperation between Russia and China, but at least in Central Asia, it's also led to a little bit of competition.
Thanks, Bruce. Let me ask you to, as a follow-up, going and thinking about the future. You've discussed the past, but what are the key obstacles you see that are in the way of Russia and Chinese closer military cooperation? You can limit it to Central Asia, if you will, or broadly speaking, and not necessarily focusing on arms trade, but actual military-to-military ties, joint efforts, and so on. What are the obstacles in your mind?
Well, I'm not going to say that Russia looks at Central Asia as its backyard. I mean, everyone hates it, at least in the field of Central Asia when you start saying that. But in fact, Russia does have a serious security interest in the region. Central Asia is one of the northernmost extensions of the Islamic world, right? So for Russia and China, this both becomes potentially the front line. And it's in their own interest, if they want to keep this away from their problems away from the border that are associated with Islamic extremism, that they invest in the Central Asian government so that they can do the work and prevent it. Russia is the one that's positioned to do this the best. They have the base in Kyrgyzstan. They already had a base in Tajikistan. And certainly in Tajikistan, Russia and China have both helped the Tajik government to increase its security. I don't see that they have that much conflict in that interest. Like I said, it's if push came to shove and there was a serious problem that spilled over the border from Afghanistan, I personally can't imagine Chinese troops participating in it. I don't think Russia would be happy to see it, especially. But for reasons not even associated so much with Russian Chinese ties, but I don't think China would go into Central Asia. So that's one place where it's a win for them. I think it's been established who's responsible for what in a security crisis in Central Asia. Now, clearly, Russia can't be happy about the economic inroads that China has made in Central Asia. If there are those people who regard this as their backyard, then China is basically looting it of all the material wealth that it has right now, which 30 years ago would have been gas, oil, things, uranium in the bank for the Soviet Union. So that's potentially a problem. And you have to wonder, although Russia doesn't seem to care very much about the economic progress China's made, you still see in Russian newspapers every now and then articles that kind of hint at the discontent of the locals with the Chinese. So they seem to be actually stoking that every now and then so that the Central Asians don't get too close to the Chinese. Like I said, though, that's one area where I can't see a big military conflict between the two, and Afghanistan would be the same way. It's in both their interests that this thing gets stabilized. Neither wants to commit troops to that country or sink a lot of money into it. Like I said, I don't know how it works out for the two of them in the Caucasus, but certainly in Central Asia, I really don't see a big conflict of interest there. And I think that Beijing understands that's Russia's responsibility if things go bad.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And you mentioned the Caucasus and the broader Black Sea Caspian region. We'll turn to that part of the geography in a second, with the second round starting with Mark. But let me just pause for a second and urge everyone to send your questions in. Use the chat box that you see at the bottom of the screen. I'm looking forward to your questions so we can keep our panelists busy here. But Mark, I promised you to give you a chance to kind of give us your take on what the rationale might be for countries far away from the sort of geography where these games were held, like Indonesia and Sri Lanka and Myanmar, what the logic is. And I guess it's linked to something that Bruce said at the beginning of his remarks, that a lot of this, at least to him, was a show. Was this also a show, and that the fact that these countries were involved is indicative of the fact that this was more of a show? Because I also heard from you, Aniva, that there are actual, new capabilities being introduced in terms of what they were doing militarily. So I want you to square that for me. And then really the question for you in this new round is, when you look at NATO and the West reaction to Kavkaz 2020, and generally speaking, Russian-Chinese military-to-military cooperation, what is your take? Is there a reaction in the West? Should there be a reaction in the West? Perhaps a different reaction in the West? Doesn't have to be an alarmist one, but what's your general sense of Western thinkings here?
Okay, well, to start with the business about whether it's a show, look, all collaborative military exercises perform multiple functions. They are military operations to hone the skills of your troops, of course. They are also opportunities to show off your fancy new toys to potential buyers. They are opportunities to build state-to-state ties. They're opportunities to create certain postures and appearances of capabilities. So from the point of view of other countries, look, the Russians are always very happy to have other people involved. In some ways, it's an extension of, they have their regular army games, a kind of military Olympics, where they're always delighted to get as many different countries as possible. And even when you have countries like Israel participating, that absolutely gets sort of hyped up. So, it is a way to basically make the Russians happy by sending some of your troops. It's a way perhaps of, particularly if you're buying Russian kit, to get a chance to actually test them out and use them with people who are much more familiar with it. I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons. But when it comes to the Russia-China relationship, I mean, that is clearly a very different and very special one. And it's one that clearly is a very neuralgic issue in the West, and particularly in Washington. And both sides, in my opinion, are very, very aware of that. And so there is always an element in which actually these cooperation measures are, however useful in practical terms, are also with one eye to showing the West, look, remember that there is this powerful military alliance and political alliance and economic partnership and so forth. And that, particularly for the Russians, matters a lot. I mean, let's be honest. China matters more to Russia than vice versa. Because at a time of increasing international isolation since 2014, the Russians have had to turn to Beijing for everything from economic deals to a chance to try and say, we still matter, we are big players in the world. But at the same time, for Russia, there is a great deal of wariness. I mean, Bruce was absolutely right about this interesting division of responsibility in Central Asia. To put it another way, Russia wants the forms of the regional hegemon, the regional security guarantor, whereas China doesn't care about that. China's fine with Russia, in effect, being the regional cop, while China just simply makes the money out of it. So, one of the key reasons is precisely there is this asymmetry in expectations in the area. But more broadly, there is a long-term concern from the point of view of Moscow. I remember once talking to an ex-Russian military officer who'd worked in the general staff, who said, look, 20 years down the line, Russia's choice will have been to be an ally of the West of some kind or a vassal of China's of some kind. Now, that may or may not be an accurate geopolitical statement, but I think it does represent a very real strand of concern within Russia, that actually, in the longer term, an economically dynamic, increasingly assertive, increasingly well-arming China will be a problem. And if one looked at the big Vostok military exercises that took place recently, yes, that much was made of the presence of a Chinese contingent. But I mean, haven't yet had the same kind of readouts on Kavkaz, but certainly talking to one of the military observers from another country who had been present at Vostok, he said that very much he got the sense that the Chinese were being kept out of a lot of the high-level command post exercises and so forth. And also what we know is the naval component of that, the Chinese were not involved with. So what they did is they sent a spy ship to shadow the military deployments. That does not sound to me like your greatest bosom buddies. So I think we have to be cautious, the extent to which this is not quite a my enemy's enemy is my friend situation, but there is a fact of these are two entirely self-interested, entirely pragmatic powers for whom a cross-play alliance is sometimes useful, but we shouldn't treat it as necessarily anything more integrated than that.
And Mark, where do you think West stands right now, or should stand, on the whole issue of Russian-Chinese military cooperation? If you could bring it closer to Black Sea, which borders NATO zone. I mean, we have NATO member states, Romania, Bulgaria right there. We have conflict in Ukraine involving Russia, sanctions being imposed on Belarus further north. I mean, if we move closer to Europe or the European heartland, how would you react? I mean, how would you assess the level of engagement, if you will, by the West, by NATO, by European Union, and if there is a role for them? I'm not sure in the case of European Union, for example, if there is a role for them at all, but certainly NATO could be considering what's going on. And what is their position? What is their take?
Well, anyway, there's not much that can be done about the specific issue of Russo-Chinese cooperation, not least because it's no one's business. We would not want to establish a principle that other countries get to have some kind of veto power on with whom we're allied. I think the Russians would be delighted. I mean, they'd be perfectly happy if they get to swap, we'll stop cooperating with China if NATO is disbanded. And the interesting thing is actually, obviously we have in the West ample geopolitical reasons to have our issues with Russia. It would be a massive blunder to connect any of those with China. We actually want to encourage the sense that that is entirely disconnected. If Russia wants to cooperate with China, especially in Central Asia and so forth, as long as it doesn't breach international laws and so forth, that's its business. But we do not, as it were, want to force China to feel that it has to defend Russian interests in, say, the Donbass or Crimea. And at the moment, China is not looking to get involved. So, I mean, I think that what we have to do is appreciate that from the West's point of view, it is in our interest to keep these as two separate strands of diplomatic and also military response.
Thank you, Mark. Neva, let me ask you the following question, which is something that Mark just raised. Mark said that, China is happy for Russia to be the policeman of the region, to sort of look after the security of the region. And I think earlier you talked about pipelines, energy pipelines that, are going in from Central Asia to China. China needs that energy. But what is the Chinese level of discomfort of having to rely on anyone, Russia or anyone else, for some of their critical, economic needs and security? That I'm talking about investment security. I mean, you could make the same kind of a argument that in the Middle East, China doesn't care that the United States is looking after the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to China. As long as the Americans do it, fine. China doesn't mind. China doesn't have to play a bigger role in the Middle East. And I think, from what I understand, that is also a concern for the Chinese. So, be it the United States or Russia or somebody else that China needs to rely on for stability in some regions of the world where China wants to be active, is active, or plans to be more active going forward, I mean, surely the Chinese want to be a bit more present on the ground. What is your assessment of that?
I think, unlike Russia, or in a way unlike the US, China actually has a long-term strategy that it is trying to achieve. China is not looking, at the moment, it's not saying that it's going to be the biggest player militarily or economically. What China wants is primarily in its, domestic policy wise, and what is the core that drives Chinese foreign policy is that China is making a world in which it is able to take Taiwan, peacefully or, forcefully. It is something that in the next 10 years, it's the time is ticking. China has to take it back. Otherwise, there is absolutely no more legitimacy for the CCP. So with that in mind, when Central Asia became independent, there was a game plan amongst some of the military leaders that they were thinking that, okay, well, we can't take Taiwan by force because the US dominate the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And because of that, China's energy, the source of energy and trade is completely dependent on the East Coast. And with that, there can be no war in South China Sea and Taiwan Strait because, then the entire Chinese economy would just, go down with it. And so when Central Asia became independent, there was some sort of discourse that opened up in China that, okay, maybe it's possible to have a land-based trade route and source of energy to kind of create economic resilience in case there's any more, escalations in the sea-based trade and energy route. So and China took this quite seriously. And when Central Asia became independent, there was a really strong wave from the highest level in Beijing that, came to convince the leaders in this very early on years. I mean, Mark pointed out, no, sorry, not Mark. Bruce, mentioned that, the forming of SCO was to sort out the border disputes. And part of the border disputes, one of the reasons why it went so smoothly was because China gave up so much of its land. And by so much of China's land, I mean China's land in the Qing dynasty, when China had a war with Russia and Russia took it. So this is, written out in treaties. And China completely gave that up. And that includes, large parts of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and also the area that is now Russia's Far East. Facing across the ocean to Japan. So those are very strategic areas that, Jiang Zemin, the Chinese president back then, completely gave away. And actually this giving away China's land actually earned Jiang Zemin the name of traitor in China. He's known as a traitor, Russia spy, and this is something that, the highest level of political leadership in China gave up to be, to earn this friendship with Central Asia and with Russia. So, sorry, I just kind of lost track of the question. I think in terms of today, the
question was, and you kind of answered it, but the question was in terms of hard security. I mean, let me put it to you this way. If you're engaged in something as comprehensive, as costly, as long-term as, say, the Belt and Road Initiative, you not have any physical ability to protect your investments. I mean, do you build ports, rails, roads, and you say the Russians will look after it? Isn't that a bit perhaps naive?
Yeah, I think, so recently I published a report, actually I have a second report coming out individually. Recently I published a report documenting 6 Chinese private security companies that work in Central Asia. So of course, China doesn't have an official presence, but since 2018, there was a very real push all the way from Xi Jinping saying that, there needs to be some sort of Chinese private security on the ground. And they're in Iraq, they're in Afghanistan, and they've been there since 2015, 2016. This is, and they have huge presence in Africa as well, but they are on the grounds of Chinese projects, which is why you don't see them, protecting, other foreign oil fields. But for example, they're here in Bishkek and they protect some of the gold mines and, some of the refineries, and they are partnering with local private security companies, because I mean, we know that, the China military sector is very weak. It doesn't really have real combat experience. Any money that they put on that they put into the sector is not really being translated into any kind of capacity that, Russia or the US have. So when it comes to private security, it's also the same, which is why whichever country they go to in Africa, for example, some of these Chinese companies have these, strong African men put on, a uniform with the Chinese flag on their arm. And so they have to rely on locals that protect them. So in Kazakhstan, the Kazakh private security and the Kazakh government is quite kind of pushing back this a little bit, because they don't want the presence of these kind of Chinese military personnel or ex-Chinese military personnel coming in, telling them how they should protect or not protect the Chinese projects. But the truth is, I mean, every single Chinese leader that is remotely high level that comes to Central Asia and visit, every single time they have to emphasize that, okay, you have to do more to protect our projects. We would like to invest, but you have to do more. And to that, Kazakh leaders or Kyrgyz, they always emphasize, yes, we're doing this, but it's just China's way of, pushing these private security companies. And since 2018, there is now a kind of mechanism where any overseas Chinese companies have to apply for this going abroad permit. And part of this permit is that they have to be trained by private security companies, or they have to be covered by private security companies. And all of these Chinese private security companies have a relationship with the local Chinese embassy, so that the embassy know who to advise to certain companies. So China is comfortable for Russia to be kind of taking the role of making sure that the security environment in Central Asia is good, but it's not really free riding that, because China is providing a lot of police equipment or military donations to Kyrgyz police, to Tajik police, and this is very real. And also arms sales. China has, before Xi Jinping, we have not seen a military industry in China that was capable of exporting arms or were interested in exporting arms. But since Xi Jinping in 2015, 16 on, we see that China supplied the entire the airbase equipment to Turkmenistan, for example, and Uzbekistan, for example, and these are countries that were willing to take Chinese arms, and for China this was a massive gesture that another country had that much faith into Chinese equipment to take Chinese arms equipment, and in China that was a big deal. That was such a political symbol that Turkmenistan was even friendlier with China than Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Niva. We have about a quarter an hour left, so we're going to go through some of the questions. We have a lot of good questions. I hope we get through some of them at least. Bruce, let me turn to you. I have a question for you, and I had a question I meant to ask you, if you don't mind. You have remarked in the past that one of the reasons why President Vladimir Putin has invested more in the CSTO, CSTO instead of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is because of being disillusioned with Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's why he went the path of CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union, if I understood you correctly. If that's the case, why? What are the disappointments? And then the question I have for you from the audience is, and I should have really asked this question, I guess, from Niva since she's in Bishkek, but here you go, get this one, Bruce. Has China or Russia had any involvement, to your knowledge, in recent unrest in Kyrgyzstan? Easy ones.
Easy ones. Let's see. Okay. Well, I guess I'll take the second one first. No, I don't see that. In fact, Russia's been trying to. China hasn't played any role at all in what's going on in Kyrgyzstan. But they haven't even, as far as I know, had any consultations with the current acting government. But whereas Russia has, they've been watching that. Can you give me the first thing again? I'm sorry, I wasn't.
So, no, the CSTO.
Okay.
Was a disappointment for Mr. Putin.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry, Bruce. I'm giving you, no, Shanghai Cooperation Organization was a disappointment. That's why he invested in CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union. I'm using your words. Maybe I'm misreading them.
No, this is fun. I think when you look at what the situation was in 1996 when they agreed with this, I don't think Russia could imagine where this was going to go in terms of Chinese relations, right? I mean, China had no footprint in Central Asia in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, all these other, they've signed an oil pipeline deal with Kazakhstan. They're already doing joint, not SCO exercises, but joint military exercises with individual Central Asian countries. That was, I don't think Russia in 1996, that's how the Kremlin saw this deal working. And then, of course, you get the Chinese investment that comes in too. Now Xi Jinping announced Belt and Road in 2013 in Kazakhstan. But I had argued before when he said that that was exactly the blueprint in Central Asia anyway. What they had been doing between 2005 to 2011 was exactly Belt and Road. It was already, by the time he announced that as a global trade network, the Central Asian part of it was almost all built and already existed. The gas pipelines, the oil pipelines, the new railways, the repaired roads, all this kind of thing. So when you're Russia and you're watching this and watch China go from being, not even a trade partner of Central Asia to becoming the largest trade partner with most of the countries, and starting to have much more significant influence, on the way the Central Asians are working, then this is kind of alarming. Now, the CSTO has existed since 1992. you might blame Yeltsin for the fact that it wasn't much of a force during the 1990s, but Putin really took a greater interest in that. And like I said, in Central Asia, there's been times where 4 of the 5 Central Asian countries were all involved in this. And I think that was, they still do conduct, pretty sophisticated exercises all the time, more so than the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does with Central Asian states now. Russia that holds regular exercises that involve all of them. They specialize in transferring forces around and stuff, because this is all counterterrorism, but they have been, like I said, for 15 years, they've been really interested in making sure that they keep their military ties real close to Central Asia, which wasn't the case before. Now, whether that was for financial reasons, I don't know, I couldn't say, but they certainly have an interest in it. And of course, the Eurasian Economic Union is something that's been kicking around for 25 years. It's existed under various names. Putin is the one that just started that, and it only had Kazakhstan for a while. But, then Kyrgyzstan joined in 2015. Tajikistan is kind of on the edge. Uzbekistan said it was an observer, I think, which is a meaningless term. You could see that this is Russia's response to China making economic inroads in Central Asia too, is they're going to have this organization with their own unified tariffs and a bunch of other things that make Russia ultimately a more interesting and attractive trade partner with Central Asia than China, which they haven't accomplished, but that's certainly one of the goals, is to keep those Central Asian countries closer to Moscow economically. And of course, always as close as possible in terms of security. But then, again, for the reasons I said, they got a base in Kyrgyzstan, they got a base in Tajikistan. The one thing the Syrian operation showed is that Russia can move large forces quickly if they have an air base they can use. So, this is another thing that always accents the fact of who actually is the power in Central Asia from outside Central Asia.
Thank you, Bruce. We have less than 10 minutes and lots of good questions, and I have to apologize in advance not being able to go through all of them. But let me start with one, at least Mark. A question here. How do Russia and China view Turkey long-term, both in terms of NATO and in terms of as an adversary, and in terms of potential regional ally?
Well, I can't really talk about China. Maybe Niva would be able to pick up on that one. But in terms of Russia, Turkey is a perennial frenemy. It is useful in some ways, especially because it is itself unhappy with the current status quo around it and has its own ambitions. But for that very same reason, it is a regional challenger. And we've seen this in the past, and particularly given Erdogan's apparent capacity to out Putin. We saw this when in, I think it was 2015, the Turks shot down a Russian bomber that was just taking a quick shortcut over Turkish airspace while his operations in northern Syria. Putin was visibly furious. We had sanctions being imposed by the Russians. And actually, Erdogan basically outweighted Putin. Eventually, he gave a kind of non-apology of the sort of, I'm sorry I had to shoot down your bomber variety. And basically, it was the Russians that backed away. And in some ways, that's what we're currently seeing in the whole Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute. In theory, Russia ought to be the one with the muscle in the region. And yet it's clear that Turkey is heavily involved. It's pushing Azerbaijan, it's arming Azerbaijan, it's putting, its own forces. Probably it's frankly Turkish operators that are running a lot of those drones that are currently being employed. We've seen Turkish jets on Azeri runways. And for all that, the Russians don't really know what to do. So I think they see Turkey on the whole as a problem these days, but nonetheless as a problem that can sometimes, they hope, be pointed towards Europe, towards NATO, and towards other sort of theaters where they'd rather see the Turks running amok.
Mark, one more for you before I move on. This one talks about, the question is, what does this large, far-reaching military capability signal for the Levant and the Middle East at large? I'm assuming Kavkaz 2020. What does it mean? Does this mean Russian push to the south and west signal a national security concern for places like Iran, Syria, Lebanon, etc.?
I think we shouldn't automatically conflate capability with intent. I mean, what Syria has demonstrated is precisely that the Russians have a capacity to deploy force further and on a more sustained basis than we believed. But the key point about Syria is precisely they were doing so in support of the government. They were not doing so on a contested level. So I think actually we should realize that the Russians do not at the moment seem to have any interest in actually preparing for hostile military operations in contested environments. But on the other hand, what this is part of Russia's interest in presenting itself precisely as a stable guarantor of security. What they want to say is, look, if you're in our gang, we can and will look after you. When they went into Syria, a whole variety of reasons, but part of it was precisely to demonstrate, we may not actually be the greatest fans of Bashar al-Assad, but the point is he's in our gang, and we do not, unlike those feckless Americans and Europeans, we do not let our guys down, and we now actually can do something about it. That, I think, is the real importance, rather than thinking that we're going to see Russian tanks rolling outwards in conquest.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Neva, last set of questions for you. I'm trying to just give you two. We only have a few minutes left. But I'm very curious, if you could say in a few sentences how you see the future of Russia and China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I want to see if you think this organization has the potential to, in your view, to sort of expand. I mean, it's expanded in terms of membership over the years, but what do you see going ahead? And in terms of the questions that are coming in, there's a question about what is China's position, if any, on what Turkey is doing in the South Caucasus, and what is China's specific position, if any, on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Are the Chinese leaning one way or another? What are the concerns? And these are the last two questions I had for you.
Okay, it's actually 3 questions, but I'll try to be quick.
Okay.
So China and Turkey, there is a very deep competition at a lot of different levels. Economically, both China and Turkey have the same market in the sense that they sell to the same group of audience. So this is a huge competition between China and Turkey. They cannot trade between each other because they produce 2 similar things. Politically, Turkey has moved on to support more, not fully support, but support more the West in terms of voicing out against what China is doing in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs population. For example, Erdogan last year canceled his trip to Beijing, the second Belt and Road Forum, to protest against China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The only area in which China and Turkey is likely to cooperate and is in both of their interests is a trade route, from China, Central Asia, Caspian Sea ferry, and Azerbaijan, Georgia, all the way crossing to Turkey. So that Azerbaijan, Georgian, Eastern Turkey railway is part of the blueprint of infrastructures that was set in stone at the second Belt and Road Forum last year. And in terms of the SCO futures, so there are a lot of pushbacks from Russia in SCO meetings where Russia wants to implement their own kind of logistics programs, whereas China likes to kind of extend, their own kind of customs agreements and things that will favor China. So this is within the SCO. It is a competition ground between who can sway the Central Asian countries. And I think earlier we were talking about, the Eurasian Economic Union. I think one of the failures, as Bruce pointed out, that it hasn't been so successful is that, Central Asians also kind of have a voice in, rejecting the kind of things that Russia put forward in the Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, Tokayev himself, repeatedly said that, it doesn't want Russia to take away its rights to implement its own trade policy. And this is something that, China is not imposing on anyone. China is building an open, and free, economy, space and market with the rules that are not favoring anyone, and it's not trying to do that because China is so sensitive that it has such a weak international image. So in SCO, they are trying to, put forward things that, are okay for everyone. So in terms of Caucasus, actually, they're a little bit more thinking on this today. So as I said earlier, China has this long-term plan to build this land-based trade route. And, how does the Caucasus come into this? So, China doesn't, so a part of this land-based trade route is to diversify from the sea base and diversify from the control of any big powers in the world. So for this trade route to work, China really needs to partner with countries that are smaller or medium sizes, like Kazakhstan, someone who's not the biggest player in the world, someone who is unable to assert its own interests directly, by force. So countries like Kazakhstan, countries like Azerbaijan are countries that China really look forward to work for in future. I mean, last year already, the Azerbaijani president went to Beijing for the second Belt and Road Forum. And also Chinese export to Azerbaijan doubled from 2014 to 2018, passing the 1 billion mark. So in Georgia, there's a lot more private Chinese investors. There's not a lot of Chinese state-led projects like they do now in Azerbaijan, and in Armenia is extremely minimal because there's no logistics network of connecting Armenia, with Azerbaijan or with Turkey vertically. There is extremely minimal. So in the long term, with this China, strategy for land-based trade route, is going to create incentives for China to create regional stability in Caucasus. And that is working more with Azerbaijan because that is going to be the linking hub of China's transit network in the next, 20, 30 years.
Thank you. Wow, that is a big headline there. Thank you. And Bruce, time is up, but you are obviously going to get 2 questions from me if you don't mind, but you can be as brief as you like to be. I actually had 3 for you, but I'll stick with 2. And these are from the audience. Bruce, US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and is that going to serve to increase Russian-Chinese cooperation or competition, both in Afghanistan or Central Asia, largely speaking? And question number 2 is, what can, in your estimation, and you are sitting in a European Union country of Czech Republic, what can the European Union do against Chinese and Russian efforts, projects, whatever you want to call it, in Central Asia, again, in your estimation? Those 2 last questions, and then we will wrap up. Floor is yours, Bruce.
Okay, great. Cooperation between China and Russia and Afghanistan. Well, I think, once again, this is a place where their interests meet. As the U.S. withdraws, I think what both those countries want to do is strengthen up the Central Asian countries that border Afghanistan as much as they can and as much as they are permitted to do, because, of course, Turkmenistan is kind of an outlier, and it's always hard to say what level of cooperation you can get with them. So the Central Asians will essentially be the proxies of Russia and China as far as border security is concerned. And that'll work out fine. I'm sure there'll be advisors, and there are now, but that'll be it for that. Now, as for the EU countering Russia and China, obviously, although I'm in the EU, I'm an American, so I'm hesitant to speak on behalf of the EU. But I have been to some of their conferences, and I think one of the things that the EU has, they released their 2.1 billion euro package for Central Asia last year, and what it does is it just targets stuff. Dealing with the EU, the Central Asian countries don't rack up a huge debt like they do to Russia and China. The equipment they get, the things that are sent out there last for a long time. They don't cost a lot. Whether that's wind or solar or whatever they're getting from them. And the EU it's a little easier for them to cooperate with the Central Asians. Again, I've been at the meetings where both of them are present because they tend to accent the fact that both of them are multi-state regions as opposed to one state, right? So the experience in Central Europe, where there's a bunch of countries, kind of they figure can translate to Central Asia and the 5 countries there, as opposed to the Central Asian countries dealing individually or collectively with Russia or with China.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We covered a lot. We've used our 1 hour, just a few minutes past the hour. We talked military, security, economics, even terrorism, and broad geopolitical trends, and plenty of history thrown in the mix. I enjoyed it. I hope everybody who watched enjoyed it. I want to thank Mark, Eva, and Bruce for your time, your expertise, and for joining us today. This was wonderful. I hope we can do it again. But as I said, time is up. So I just want to thank our panel for being here today, joining us, and for everybody who was watching. And thanks very much for your questions. That's it for today. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.